Hi, my name is Ned Wellman. I'm an associate professor at Arizona State University's W.P. Carey School of Business and an associate editor at AMJ. And in this video, my purple AMJ shirt and I are going to take you through some tips on navigating the review process. So buckle your seatbelts. Here we go. First of all, if you have received an R&R from AMJ, you should take a minute to feel really, really good about that and congratulate yourself, because receiving an R&R at AMJ puts you in some very elite company. Here's what the statistics look like. About half of all the submissions that we get to the journal are desk rejected. That means they don't even go out to the editor and reviewers for the blind review process. Of those half that go out, only about 25% receive R&Rs. So mostly when they go out to the reviewers and the editor, the decision that comes back is, sorry, not the right fit for this journal. So if you receive a revise and resubmit, you can do that math. It means that your paper falls in roughly the top 15% of all manuscripts that have been submitted to AMJ. And we're one of the best journals, so we get many manuscripts. So congratulations. It really is an accomplishment to get and revise and resubmit invitation. And yet, sometimes it doesn't feel like such a great accomplishment, right? I've had this experience of, yes, I got to revise and resubmit, and then reading the letter from the editor, and my excitement kind of goes down. And then I get to the reviewers and it goes down even more. And I start thinking, oh crap, how in the world am I going to do this? We can get critical feedback from reviewers about papers that we've poured our blood, sweat, and tears into. We can perceive that there's not always agreement amongst reviewers about how to move forward. Almost always, the way forward is going to involve a significant amount of work. And it combined with this language, especially early in the process, that this is a high-risk undertaking. You're not guaranteed to succeed. And so it's possible that you could invest this time in revising the paper and then still get rejected. So there's a lot of emotional experience that comes along in addition to the excitement. So in this video, my goal is to help you navigate that process in a way that keeps you sane and improves your chances of success. And I'm going to go through some tips of my own, but would also like to emphasize that I'm very much standing on the shoulders of giants in this space, and to recommend some prior resources about navigating the review process that are also helpful. So we live in the age of generative AI, and the first thing I did in preparing my remarks was ask for some help from our future robot overlords. And here are the top 5 AI tips about how you can navigate the review process. So our robot co-brains would tell us, first of all, you have to carefully analyze reviewer feedback. That's true. You do want to, in revising your paper, systematically think about and respond to the things that the reviewers had to say. 2, create a plan for the revision. 3, revise methodically and clearly. 4, consider the editor's comments as well. I certainly agree with that comment as an editor myself. I want people to pay attention to my guidance and recommendations as well as the reviewers. And then highlight changes and justify your decisions in the letter. So these are all good tips. And yet, as I was looking at this, there was some piece of this advice that seemed a little bit missing or incomplete. And so, to build on our robot advice, AI advice, I'm going to offer some human advice. These are my top 5 human value-added tips that I think are important in managing this review process. And these tips are geared at the understanding of we are not unfeeling algorithms that are approaching this process. We're human beings. And these human elements of the process are as important, I think, as the more logical elements. So here are my top 5 value-added tips. In addition, each tip, you're going to get a personalized quote from me, something that either I've read or that's come up in my life that seemed relevant to each tip. So we're going to go through the tips quickly. Here we go. First tip about the review process is to get your mind right. My quote for this tip came from Nancy Rothbard, who is a professor at the Wharton School of Business. And when I was a junior faculty member, I attended the OB conference for junior faculty that they would host every year. And they had a session on the review process. And all of us had had negative experiences. And we were kind of grumbling and griping about this process. And it's so hard. And why don't the reviewers understand? And it takes so much time. And Nancy was overseeing the session. And she kind of sat back in the back of the room. And then eventually she politely interjected and said, you know what? You're not wrong. But the thing about the peer review process is it makes our papers better. And isn't that the goal? And I thought about that for a little bit. And I said, you know what? She's right. My experience with the review process hasn't always been pleasant, but it has generally made my papers better. And isn't that what I want as a scholar, is to have my work be presented in its best possible format so it can be the most impactful. But it's a little bit hard to get to that place and that mindset when we're reading through these critical decision letters that we get, or critical comments. So I think it's important that before we start any of the scholarly work, we try to do a little mindset work and make sure that we're not in this default mindset, which I typically am in the first day or so after I get the responses, where I feel like what I need to do in responding to this R&R is to defend myself against attacks from these misinformed or cruel reviewers who just don't get what I'm trying to do and are trying to sabotage my work. And I think about it, I don't think that's actually the case at all. And in fact, my experience as an editor has made it abundantly clear that the reviewers who get your manuscript are very busy people, and they're really doing a nice favor of putting so much time and energy into reading your work and providing suggestions about how it could be better. So my first tip is, as you approach the review process, try to fight against this mindset that you're adversarial with the review team, and instead open yourself up to feedback from people who are on the same team as you, who are generously giving their time and talents to help you make your paper better, and who saw something in your paper, because you wouldn't have gotten a revise and resubmit if they didn't. Step 2 is to manage your emotions. My quote for this tip comes from my colleague Jack Zwingli, who's a former CEO who has become convinced that emotional intelligence is the key to all leadership and business problems. And he extends that to procrastination. So we taught a class together, and his point in one of the classes was, if you're procrastinating, you've got an emotion regulation problem. And at first I thought about that, and I was like, I don't know, Jack. It seems like you might just have a willpower problem or a laziness problem. But the more that I thought about it, the more I realized that I think he's actually right. And its tendency for many of us, including myself, is to sit on some of these R&Rs because we don't want to do the emotional work involved in processing them. And it's typical to actually experience some negative emotions when you get a revise and resubmit. There's the excitement, and then as I mentioned, it's going to come hand in hand with maybe some anger. If there's a reviewer or editor comment that's asking you to do something that you feel like is unfair, maybe you'll feel some sadness. Well, I really like this part about the paper. This was my dissertation study, and now they're asking me to pare it back, all that work that I did. I'm sad at losing that. We might also experience some fear of, boy, there's no guarantees here. They say high risk. What if this gets rejected in the long run? And so my thesis in terms of tip number 2, why this is important, is that before you dive into dissecting the review and doing all the things that the AI said is critical, our ability to do that is going to be dramatically enhanced if we first do the emotional work to deal with these different emotions, to understand our anger and sadness, maybe do some grieving, do some fear. So here's how we might do that. Here's some emotion management practices that work for me. First, you can vent. So sharing with co-authors, colleagues, friends, spouses, random people on the street that you pass by is all helpful. It helps get it out there. In terms of anger, I also will write my first draft of the response letter is just completely unfiltered. So I will actually go through and say the first thing that pops into my head when I respond to all the reviewers' comments. Very important thing about this tip is to make sure that you edit it. So you go through and tone that down. But for me, this is actually a helpful exercise of letting go of any negative feelings. I get to tell people exactly what I feel, and then I let that go. For sadness, if you're sad about losing things, one of the things that helps me is to create a recycle bin where if I'm taking this out of the paper, I'm not just throwing it in the trash. I'm going to leave it here. Maybe there's a piece of it that I can use later, or if I go back and submit to a different journal, I'll have that. And then finally, for fear, I think it helps to have a perspective on what high risk really means. So we can read this language, which is in many of our first R&R decision letters, and say, wow, I could still get rejected. But the truth is, if you've gotten that first revise and resubmit, your chances of success go up exponentially. So we know from analyzing our data, you have a 25% chance if your paper goes out for review of getting your first R&R. Once you get the first R&R, you have a 50% chance of getting a second R&R. Once you get the second R&R, pretty much most of those papers are going to get published. There's only about 10% of those papers that don't make it. So every time through, your chances get better and better. And so it's true that there's not a guarantee. It's also true that if you've made it past that first hurdle, that's a pretty significant accomplishment, and you should at least feel better about your chances. Another thing that you can do is identify what your next action is on the paper. So instead of procrastinating, figure out, here's the next tangible thing that I can do. And then just have confidence in your ability to master the review process. So this is a skill. There are people who are better at responding and navigating this process, and there are people who are worse, and you can do things that are controllable to improve your chances of success by getting really good at the process. Speaking of which, that's my third tip. Find a process for all this that works for you. Get a little literary on us here with my next quote, which is from William Shakespeare, who incidentally shares my same birthday. But this quote is from Hamlet, says, "Though he be mad, there is a method in it." And I think if someone was to look at my process for dealing with an R&R, there might be certain things where like, that's crazy, but it works for me. And so the key thing here is to find a process that works for you. Don't just jump in and do a bunch of random activities. When you get an R&R, have a process that you refine over time. In case it's helpful, here's what my process is. Number one, do that raw first draft of the response letter. Number two, pretty quickly after, go back and clean that up and tone it down. Then I share that with co-authors. So if this is a multiple authored paper, I will set up a meeting with my authorship team. I'll share this clean draft, which has the reviewers and editors' comments and then my ideas about how we might respond. From there, we get together and brainstorm, okay, what are we actually going to do to the paper? I put together a revision needs document. Then we do things in the document. So sometimes that means analyzing data in a different way, running another study, doing a robustness check, those sorts of things. Then I go back and make the changes to the manuscript. Once I go back to the manuscript, I go iterate back to the response letter, because normally that initial version of the response letter is aspirational. There's 2 or 3 things that I wasn't able to quite do the way I wanted in the paper, so I change that, make sure it's consistent, and I keep iterating back and forth between the paper and letter until I have both of them at a place where I feel good. But again, the key is maybe not for you. What I'm saying is you don't need to adopt this process exactly like that, but just figure out what works for you and make sure that you're refining this over time. For most things, people that involve repetition, it's good to have a routine that you follow. Like I used to play basketball. I used to do the same thing every time when I was shooting free throws. Now that I've hurt my knee, I'm not playing so much basketball. I'm working on golf. But again, a routine that allows you to feel comfortable with the process. Tip number 4, save the baby. This quote comes from my former youth soccer coach named Paul Laughlin, who used to yell and scream crazy things at us all the time. But one of the things that he used to yell, I used to be the defender, the ball would be coming to me and he would get down on his knees like this and he would say, "Save the baby, Ned, save the baby." And to this day, I actually have no idea what he meant in a soccer context. That seems like a crazy thing to say to a soccer player. But for some reason, this quote pops into my head sometimes when I'm thinking about the review process, because I do think it's important in this process to save the baby. And what is the baby? It's the thing about your paper that the reviewers really liked or the editor really liked, the potential that they saw in it. The good stuff is the reason why you're one of the 15% of papers that gets the R&R. And sometimes what I've seen as an editor is people that get so carried away and trying to be responsive and change the paper and respond to the reviewers that they end up weakening or completely eliminating, in a worst case scenario, the parts of the paper that the team liked in the first place. And then I get responses from the reviewers like, this revision has actually made the paper worse. Or I really liked comments, hypothesis 1. What happens to hypothesis 1? What happened to study 2? That was great. So anyways, an important skill in reading through reviews is to understand not just what needs to go, but also what should stay. What are the real strengths of the paper that the reviewers are seeing and how to accentuate those. And do your best to avoid making major changes that introduce new elements of the paper that weren't at least suggested by the review team, or take out an aspect of the paper that the review team responded to positively. So that's the baby. Find your piece of this paper that's the nugget of promise and potential and save it as you go through the review process. Final tip, own your own experience. So I think it's real easy as we move through the review process to assign agency over our work, our ideas, our paper, to the editor and to the reviewers and say, well, I have to do it this way. This is a quote from a leadership book called Extreme Ownership that was written by 2 Navy SEALs. And their point is, for leaders, you, at the end of the day, as a leader, need to take responsibility for the things that happen. You can't blame anyone else. And this is maybe not always true, but most of the time it is true, I find. And I think the same thing is true as we enter the review process. We have to remember that these are our team members, editors and reviewers, part of the review team. But at the end of the day, we're the authors and we get to make that final decision. They can't make us do anything to the paper. And ultimately, when this work is published, your name is the one that people are going to see. And so you have to make sure that the work that gets out is work that you feel good about. So this means that it can be a good thing to selectively push back on guidance that you feel strongly will harm the final product. So if people are making a suggestion and you've really thought about it and you've engaged with it and you feel like it would harm the paper, you shouldn't follow the suggestion. I will say it's good to not push back on every suggestion. So it's nice to be able to tell the reviewers and the editors, you suggested 9 things. We did 7 of them. Here are the 2 that we didn't quite follow your advice, and here's why. But then again, responding with a respectful, well-reasoned explanation and offering to continue the conversation puts you in that teamwork mindset. So here's coming to the end of this video. Probably went a little over 15 minutes, but I'm an academic. What can I say? Uh, we got two sets of tips on how to navigate the review process. One from AI, and one from me, the more human value-added tips. And you'll see the AI is more about the nuts and bolts of executing the revision. Mine are a little bit more about the personal elements to making sure you're in a good place emotionally, mentally, to do this. But if we combine these two, my hope for you is that you will become this new hybrid strain of super scholars that has the best of both worlds and is able to really crush this review process. And also, I hope that this has demystified the process a little bit for some of you and given you some ideas about things you might incorporate as you tackle your next R&R. I look forward to seeing all of your work in press. Hope this video has been helpful. Thank you very much for your attention.